Be me, Mia. Work in HR. Not some entry-level paper pusher. I'm in a position to actually make changes. For years, I've been watching the dynamics in this company. It's a tech firm, so it's pretty male-dominated, especially in the creative and development departments. And I've seen the same story play out a dozen times. A project kicks off with a lot of energy. Then the egos start clashing. Guys trying to one-up each other, turning meetings into verbal wrestling matches. You'd see the loud ones drowning out the quiet, brilliant ones. You'd see passive aggression over who gets credit for what. Projects would get delayed, not because the work was hard, but because of the friction between people. The constant, low-level hum of male toxicity. It was like a tax on productivity, this need to always establish a pecking order. I was sick of it. I truly believed that most workplace conflict was a product of the patriarchal structures we're all forced to operate in. Men are socialized to be competitive, to dominate. Women are socialized to be collaborative. It seemed so obvious to me. If you could just remove that male ego from the equation, you could create a perfectly harmonious and efficient work environment. A big new design project was announced. High stakes. A complete rebranding for a major client. This was my chance. I spent a week putting together a proposal, a detailed, data-driven argument for an experimental team structure, an all-female design team. I called it the Synergy Initiative. The idea was to create a safe, collaborative space where creative ideas could flourish without being crushed by aggressive competition. I scheduled a meeting with my boss, the head of the department. He's a decent guy, but very old school. One of those pragmatists who only cares about the bottom line. I walked into his office, proposal in hand, ready for a fight. I laid it all out. The data on project delays, the anonymous feedback from exit interviews mentioning a boys' club atmosphere, the studies on collaborative work styles. He listened patiently, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished my grand speech, he just looked at me with a tired, skeptical expression. He wasn't angry. He was just amused, I think. He told me he didn't care about social experiments. His exact words were something like, "Mia, I don't care if the team is all women, all men, or a group of trained chimpanzees. All I care about is whether this project is delivered on time and exceeds the client's expectations." He said he had his doubts, that he believed putting any group of the same kind of people together was a recipe for creating blind spots. But then he shrugged. He said, "You're the HR expert. You're telling me this will eliminate drama and boost efficiency. Fine, you can have your team, but your neck is on the line. If this project fails, it's your failure, entirely." I was ecstatic. I didn't hear the warning, only the yes. I told him he wouldn't regret it, that this would be the most effective and cohesive team in the company's history. He just nodded slowly and said, "We'll see." So I got to work assembling my dream team. First was Michaela. She was a rising star in the design department. Ambitious, confident, a great speaker, the natural leader type, exactly what we needed to interface with the client. Then there was Adriana. She was the opposite of Michaela, incredibly quiet, almost painfully shy, but her portfolio was breathtaking. She was a pure talent, a design genius who just needed a safe space to thrive. I saw her as someone who was constantly overlooked in the male-dominated environment. Next, I picked Kaylani. She was the social glue. Super friendly, always knew what was going on in the office, great at networking. She'd be perfect for team morale. Finally, I added Soraya. She was younger, a bit inexperienced, but so eager and positive. She had a great attitude and was desperate to learn. I figured she'd be the perfect supportive team player. The five of us, Mia, Michaela, Adriana, Kailani, and Soraya. The perfect blend of leadership, talent, social skills, and positive energy. The first 2 weeks were pure bliss. It was everything I had imagined. We had a kickoff meeting, and instead of the usual posturing, we spent the first hour just talking. People shared their anxieties about the project, their hopes. It was vulnerable and supportive. Michaela was a fantastic leader, setting a positive tone and encouraging everyone. Our group chat was constantly buzzing with encouragement, positive emojis, and shared articles. We had team lunches where we didn't even talk about work. It felt less like a project team and more like a group of friends. We had a small initial task from the client, a preliminary mood board. The team tackled it with incredible energy. Ideas flowed freely. Nobody shot anyone else down. Adriana, who usually never spoke in large meetings, was sketching out concepts on the whiteboard, and everyone was listening intently. We delivered the mood board 2 days ahead of schedule. The client loved it. I felt so vindicated. I wrote a glowing email to my boss and the department heads, highlighting the early success and attributing it to our unique collaborative framework. I might have been a little smug about it. I honestly thought we had cracked the code. Then the real work began. The core design phase. The team had a major brainstorming session to decide on the central concept for the rebranding. It was a long meeting. Lots of ideas were thrown around. Towards the end, when everyone was getting tired, Adriana went up to the whiteboard. She quietly sketched out an idea. It wasn't flashy, but it was brilliant. It was one of those concepts that was so smart and simple, you couldn't believe nobody had thought of it before. It perfectly captured the client's brand identity while also being fresh and modern. The room went silent. Everyone knew that was it. That was the winning idea. Michaela was the first to speak. She praised Adriana, saying it was genius and that she was the creative heart of the team. Everyone else chimed in. Adriana just blushed and quietly sat down. I felt a surge of pride. This was my vision in action, a quiet talent being given the space to shine. A few days later, we had the big presentation with the department head and other stakeholders. Michaela was the designated presenter. She stood up at the front of the room, confident and polished, as always. She started the presentation, and she presented Adriana's idea as if it were her own. She didn't just present it, she owned it. She talked about her process for arriving at the concept, the late nights she spent refining it. She used the word I a lot. I decided to go in this direction because my vision for this was, towards the end, she made a small, throwaway comment. And of course, the whole team contributed with some great feedback to help me polish it. I was sitting at the back of the room, stunned. I looked over at Adriana. She was just staring at her notepad, her face completely blank. She didn't move a muscle. The department head loved the concept. He was full of praise for Michaela's leadership and creative vision. After the meeting, I felt weird. Part of me was telling me this was wrong, a blatant theft of credit. But another part of me was trying to rationalize it. Michaela was the leader. Maybe this was just how leadership worked. She was representing the team's work. Perhaps it was naive to expect a detailed breakdown of who did what in a high-level presentation. Strong women have to be assertive, right? Maybe this was just assertiveness. I decided not to say anything. I didn't want to rock the boat. The team was still in its early stages. I told myself it was a one-time thing. But something had shifted. The air in the room felt different. The constant, happy chatter in the group chat started to die down. It became more formal, just work-related announcements. Then the cliques started to form. It was subtle at first. Kailani, the social butterfly, became Michaela's shadow. They would go for coffee together and come back whispering. They started an inside joke that only they and Soraya, who was desperate to be liked, seemed to understand. Adriana was on the outside. She wasn't explicitly excluded, but she was ignored. If she asked a question in the chat, there would be a long silence before someone gave a short, blunt answer. When she spoke in meetings, Michaela would listen with a polite, dismissive smile. Kailani was the engine of this social division. I saw her in action one afternoon. She came over to my desk, ostensibly to ask a question about her vacation days. Then she leaned in conspiratorially. She started talking about how worried she was about Adriana. She said things like, "She just doesn't seem like a team player, you know? She has this attitude, like she's better than everyone else." And I think she's upset that Michaela is the team lead. There's some creative jealousy there. It's creating a really negative vibe. It was all framed as concern, but it was pure poison. She was planting these ideas in my head. And because I was so invested in the success of the team, I started to believe her. My own bias was working against me. I wanted a simple explanation for the growing tension, and one person's bad attitude was easier to accept than the idea that my feminist utopia was fundamentally flawed. The work started to suffer. The project was now split into different components, with each person responsible for a section. But all the sections had to integrate seamlessly with Adriana's core concept. This required constant communication and collaboration. But that collaboration wasn't happening. Adriana would finish a component and upload it to the shared server. A day later, the file would be gone. When she'd ask about it, Michaela would feign surprise. "Oh, that's so weird. I don't know what happened. Maybe you forgot to save it properly." It happened 3 times. Then there was the feedback. Instead of discussing things in person, Kailani and Michaela would leave anonymous, passive-aggressive comments on Adriana's mock-ups. Vague notes like, "This feels a bit uninspired," or "Not sure this aligns with the core vision." It was impossible to act on, designed only to undermine confidence. Soraya was caught in the middle. Michaela had taken her under her wing, but in a controlling way. She would give Soraya tasks that were way above her skill level, and then criticize her relentlessly when she struggled. I'd see Michaela standing over Soraya's desk, talking in a low, condescending tone, pointing at the screen. Soraya started looking stressed all the time. Her work was consistently late because she was so afraid of getting it wrong. Adriana tried to help her once. She saw Soraya struggling with a piece of software and quietly went over to offer some advice. Michaela saw this from across the room. She walked over and in a loud, cheerful voice said, "Thanks, Adriana, but we've got it handled. It's important for Soraya to learn on her own. We don't want to create a culture of dependency." It was a public humiliation. Adriana just retreated back to her desk and put her headphones on. The project was falling behind schedule. The atmosphere was thick with resentment. There was no open conflict, no shouting matches like the ones I'd seen between male colleagues. This was different. It was a quiet, suffocating toxicity. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. I knew I had to do something. My entire professional credibility was on the line. I decided to use my HR skills. We needed a controlled intervention, a safe space for open dialogue. I booked a conference room for a mandatory team harmony session. I started the meeting with a speech about trust, vulnerability, and the importance of open communication. I said I wanted everyone to use "I feel" statements to express themselves without casting blame. It was the biggest mistake I could have made. I had just handed them the perfect weapon. Michaela went first. She put on a masterful performance. Her voice was trembling slightly. She looked like she was on the verge of tears. She said, "I feel hurt. I feel like my leadership is being constantly undermined. I've been trying so hard to build a supportive environment, but I feel like there's a wall of negativity coming from some members of the team." She never said Adriana's name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. Then it was Kailani's turn. She nodded in agreement with Michaela. She said, "I feel scared to share my ideas sometimes. I feel like they'll be instantly judged or dismissed. The creative energy we had at the beginning is gone, and it feels like it's being deliberately sabotaged. Soraya just mumbled something about feeling stressed and looked at the floor. Then it was Adriana's turn. The entire focus of the room was on her. She looked trapped. She took a deep breath and tried to stick to the facts. She said, "My files have been deleted multiple times. The concept we are all working on was my idea, and I was not given credit." I held up my hand and stopped her. I told her, "Adriana, let's stick to the format. We're not here to make accusations. Tell us how you feel." I thought I was being a good mediator. I was trying to de-escalate. In reality, I was invalidating the one person who was telling the truth. Adriana just looked at me. It wasn't an angry look. It was a look of profound disappointment. She said, "I feel like this is a waste of time." And then she went completely silent. The meeting was a disaster. I had made things 1,000 times worse. I had publicly sided with the bullies and isolated the victim. I ended the session with some empty platitudes about moving forward and recommitting to our shared goals. Nobody was listening. After that day, the pretense was over. Adriana completely disengaged. She still came to work. She still did her tasks. But she was a ghost. She put her headphones on the moment she sat down and didn't take them off until she left. She communicated only through email and only when absolutely necessary. Her messages were short, formal, and to the point. She stopped uploading her work to the shared server. She would email her completed components directly to me with timestamps at the end of each day. It was a classic work-to-rule protest, an Italian strike. Without her creative problem-solving and willingness to help, the rest of the team was lost. Michaela, for all her confident talk, couldn't actually solve the complex design problems that came up. Kailani was useless for anything other than gossip, and Soraya was too paralyzed by fear to be effective. The project ground to a halt. Deadlines were being missed. The client was starting to send concerned emails. I was in a state of constant low-grade panic. My perfect, harmonious team had become the most dysfunctional, toxic workplace I had ever witnessed, and I had no idea how to fix it. My boss started calling me into his office for progress reports. He never raised his voice. He just sat there, looking at me with that same tired, knowing expression from our first meeting. He'd ask me simple questions I couldn't answer. Why was this deliverable missed? Why is the client flagging inconsistencies in the design language? What is the current projection for the project timeline? I would babble about creative challenges and interpersonal dynamics we're working through. He knew I was lying, or at least he knew I was hiding the truth. The final presentation to the client was looming. We were nowhere near ready. Michaela, in a desperate attempt to show progress, tried to stitch together their fragmented pieces of work into a coherent whole. The result was a Frankenstein's monster of a design: clashing colors, inconsistent fonts, broken user flows. It was a complete mess. She called a last-minute team meeting the day before the presentation. She didn't even pretend to be nice anymore. She told Adriana that this was all her fault, that her refusal to collaborate had sabotaged the entire project. Kailani chimed in, saying Adriana had a terrible attitude from the very beginning. Adriana didn't say a word. She just sat there, listening, with that same blank expression. I tried to intervene, to say something, but I didn't even know what to say anymore. My authority was gone. My ideals were a joke. I had created this monster, and it was about to devour me. The night before the final presentation was one of the longest of my life. I sat at my desk long after everyone else had gone home, just staring at the project files. It was an absolute train wreck. Nothing connected. The core branding message, so clear in Adriana's original concept, was completely lost in a sea of mismatched assets and confusing layouts. Michaela's sections were flashy but shallow. Kailani's were just sloppy copies of things I'd seen in other brand guides. Soraya's work was hesitant and unfinished. And then there was Adriana's part. It was a silo, a perfect polished island in the middle of a swamp. It was so well executed that it made everything around it look 10 times worse. I felt a wave of nausea. My boss's words echoed in my head. Your neck is on the line. In a moment of sheer desperation, I did something I shouldn't have. I walked over to Adriana's empty desk. I knew she often stayed late, working quietly. I thought maybe I could catch her, appeal to her one last time. I waited for almost an hour. She never came back. I realized she must have started leaving exactly on time, not giving the company a single extra minute of her time. I couldn't blame her. I went home and barely slept. I kept replaying the entire project in my head, every mistake, every ignored red flag. My perfect theory had dissolved into this ugly personal drama that I had enabled at every turn. The day of the presentation arrived. We all gathered in the main conference room. It was one of those big glass-walled rooms that made you feel like you were in an aquarium. The main client stakeholders were on the big screen via video conference. My boss was there in person, sitting at the far end of the table. He wasn't looking at us. He was just quietly reading something on his tablet, a neutral expression on his face. The air was freezing. Michaela, to her credit, looked the part. She was dressed impeccably. Her notes were organized. She was the picture of a confident leader. She started the presentation. For the first 5 minutes, her charisma carried it. She talked about brand synergy and disruptive aesthetics. Then she put the actual designs on the screen. Silence. One of the clients, a woman from their marketing department, tilted her head. She asked, "Can you go back one slide? The logo treatment on this page seems very different from the one on the previous page." Michaela faltered for a second. That's an intentional variation to show the flexibility of the new branding. The client didn't look convinced. And the user journey you've mapped out here, it seems to have a dead end. This button doesn't link anywhere. It got worse from there. They started pointing out all the inconsistencies, the sloppy work, the fundamental design flaws. It was a slow, painful dissection of our failure. I watched Michaela's composure start to crack. Her confident smile became a tight, strained grimace. She knew it was over, so she played her final card. She decided to burn it all down. She took a deep breath and adopted a somber, serious tone. She said, "I want to be transparent with you. We've faced some significant internal challenges on this project." She paused for dramatic effect. While most of the team has been working in lockstep, we've unfortunately had to contend with a lack of collaborative spirit from certain individuals. It has been a difficult situation to manage, trying to integrate a team member who seems resistant to working towards a shared goal. She glanced pointedly at Adriana. Adriana didn't even flinch. She just continued to stare at the screen. My boss looked up from his tablet. He hadn't said a word until this point. He just watched Michaela, his eyes unreadable. Michaela took his silence as encouragement to continue. "This has led to unavoidable silos and integration issues. We've done our best to salvage the situation, but the project has been a victim of internal sabotage." She actually used the word sabotage. The clients on the screen looked deeply uncomfortable. They were here for a design presentation, not a public HR complaint. I felt my stomach drop. This was it, the official implosion. Then my boss finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it cut through the tension in the room like a knife. "Thank you, Michaela. That's enough." He stood up and walked to the front of the room. He said to the clients on the screen, "My apologies for this. What you've just seen is not the standard of work we aim for. Please allow me to show you something else." He plugged his own laptop into the projector. He said, "Michaela is right about one thing. There were silos, In fact, one team member was forced to work in a complete silo. He projected his screen. It was his email inbox. He opened an email from Adriana, dated a week ago. The subject line was Project Component 7, Final Version. He opened the attached file. On the screen, a perfectly rendered, fully functional piece of the design appeared. It was clean, brilliant, and perfectly aligned with the original concept. He then opened another email and another. He had a whole folder of them, weeks' worth of daily submissions from Adriana. He created a split screen. On one side was the chaotic mess Michaela had presented. On the other side was Adriana's methodical, complete work. The difference was devastating. It was like looking at a professional blueprint next to a child's crayon drawing. "As you can see," my boss said, his voice still level, "Adriana has been completing her work diligently and to an exceptionally high standard. She has also been documenting her progress and submitting it directly, with timestamps, to avoid any confusion." He then pulled up another folder. This one contained screenshots of the shared server's activity log. It showed Adriana's files being uploaded and then deleted a few hours later. It showed anonymous negative comments being left on her drafts. Michaela's face had gone completely white. Kailani looked like she was going to be physically sick. My boss turned to the clients. "The project is not a failure. The management of the project was a failure. We have a solid foundation here, thanks to Adriana's work. We will be restructuring the team, and we will deliver a final product that exceeds your expectations. You have my word." The meeting ended quickly after that. The clients, reassured, logged off. The rest of us sat in stunned silence in the glass-walled room. Michaela, Kailani, Soraya, and me, and Adriana, who was quietly packing her laptop into her bag. As she stood up to leave, my boss said, "Adriana, a moment, please." She stopped. He said, "I'm putting you in charge of the new project team. You'll report directly to me. You have full authority to pick your own people from any department. Whatever you need, you get." Adriana just looked at him for a long moment. Then she gave a single, small nod, and she walked out of the room. It was the most powerful exit I have ever witnessed. The next day, the official fallout came. A company-wide email announced that the rebranding project was being rebooted under new leadership. Soraya submitted her resignation that morning. The email to me was short. She just said she was leaving for a role at another company and wished us the best. Michaela and Kailani were not fired. My boss was smarter than that. Firing them would have allowed them to become martyrs or claim some kind of unfair dismissal. Instead, they were reassigned. Michaela, the ambitious star who loved the spotlight, was moved to the Quality Assurance Department. Her new job was to spend 8 hours a day testing old software for bugs, filling out repetitive spreadsheets. It was a career graveyard. Kailani, the social manipulator who thrived on information, was assigned to digitizing the company's old paper archives. She was put in a windowless room in the basement with a scanner and thousands of boxes of documents. She was completely cut off from the social life of the office. It was a slow, quiet, corporate execution, a fate worse than being fired for people like them. And then it was my turn. My boss called me into his office at the end of the day. He wasn't angry. He was just weary. He had Soraya's resignation letter on his desk, alongside a preliminary report on the financial cost of the project's delay. He gestured for me to sit down. He was quiet for a long time, just looking at me. Finally, he said, "Do you remember our first conversation about this? About your Synergy initiative?" I nodded, unable to speak. "You made me a promise, Mia. You promised me the most efficient, most harmonious team in the company's history. You promised to eliminate the drama." He leaned forward slightly. "Instead, you created the single most toxic, dysfunctional, and destructive team I have ever seen in my 20 years at this company. You didn't eliminate toxicity. You just changed its flavor. He picked up Soraya's resignation letter. You lost us a good employee. You almost lost us a major client. And you nearly destroyed the career of your most talented designer. He looked me straight in the eye. It turns out that toxicity, backstabbing, and ego aren't male traits, Mia. They're human traits. And a good manager's job is to handle them, not pretend they can be magically eliminated by creating a gender-based echo chamber. He leaned back. Your experiment is over, and it was a complete failure. I just sat there. There was nothing I could say. He was right. Every word was true. I had been so blinded by my own ideology that I couldn't see what was happening right in front of me. I had mistaken my theory for a fact. I had sacrificed real people on the altar of my own beliefs. He didn't fire me either. He said my punishment was to stay in my job and deal with the mess I had created. I had to handle the paperwork for Soraya's exit, process the reassignments for Michaela and Kaylani, and write the official project post-mortem, detailing every single one of my failures. I left his office and walked back to my desk. The office was empty. A few weeks later, I saw Adriana in the hallway. She was walking with two other designers, one man and one woman. They were laughing about something, looking at a sketch on a tablet. She looked happy, relaxed, confident. She didn't even notice me as she walked past, and I realized I was just part of the scenery now, a ghost from a failed experiment. I created the most toxic workplace ever, and the only thing that had been patriarchal about the situation was the man who had to step in and clean up my mess. I still work here, but I don't propose theories anymore. I just push the papers.